Wyoming Territory, July 1879, the woman came stumbling out of the cottonwoods just past sundown, her dress torn at the sleeve, her lips split, and her hands shaking like autumn leaves in wind. She looked half-starved, dust-caked, and near ready to drop. Elijah Boone had just stepped down from his saddle, leading his horse toward the creek for water. When he saw her across the clearing alone, limping, wild-eyed, he dropped the reins. "Madam?" His voice was steady, low. He did not move toward her, not yet. She blinked at him like someone waking from a nightmare. Her chest rose and fell too fast, and her boots scraped forward another few steps before her knees gave out. She collapsed hard onto the packed dirt. Elijah was beside her in an instant, kneeling. "You all right? Can you hear me?" She nodded, barely. Her lips parted, but no words came. He pulled his canteen from his belt and held it to her mouth. She drank with a desperate kind of need, water running down her chin. He waited until she pushed it away on her own. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Josie," she rasped. "Josie Granger." He looked her over, no shoes, bruises on her arms, one of her eyes starting to swell. "You hurt bad anywhere?" she swallowed. "No, just sore." "All right, my name's Elijah. We're about 10 miles from Willow Ridge. My ranch is closer. You can rest there, safe." He waited a beat. "Can you ride?" She flinched at the word. I can try." He helped her stand, slow and careful. She leaned into him like she could barely hold herself up, and he felt how slight she was beneath the dirt and fear. He did not ask questions yet. Did not say a word when she winced as he lifted her into the saddle. He mounted up behind her, steadying her with one arm as he turned the horse toward home. Elijah's ranch sat low in a quiet valley, tucked between the ridges, the house plain but solid. He brought her inside, lit the lamp, and went straight to the stove. She sat at his table, silent, eyes darting to every shadow like something might leap from it. "You do not have to talk," he said, setting a cup of hot coffee in front of her. "Just sit a while, warm up." She stared at the cup, then at him. "You live alone," he nodded. "3 years now. Why help me?" He met her eyes. "Because you needed it." She looked down at her hands. The bruises across her knuckles were faint but old. "Most men would ask what I did to deserve it. I am not most men." She pressed her lips together like she wanted to believe that. Her shoulders sank just a little. He made her a plate: beans, bread, a few slices of salted pork. She ate like it was the first real food in days. He did not ask anything until she scraped the plate clean. "You running from someone?" Her jaw tightened. "Yes," he waited. "A man, my step-uncle. He took me in after my parents died. I was 17. I stayed too long. I thought if I kept my head down, he would leave me be. He did not." Elijah's fingers curled around the edge of the table. "I left 2 days ago. Took his mule and rode till it collapsed. Walked the rest." Her voice shook. "I did not plan to go anywhere, just away." She looked up then, and there was something raw in her eyes. "I do not want pity." "You are not getting it," Elijah said. "You are getting rest. And a place to feel safe for once." Tears welled before she could stop them. She turned her head away fast, wiping at her cheek with the back of her hand. "I have a spare room," he said, standing. "Fresh linens. You can wash up, sleep. You do not owe me anything." She hesitated, then nodded once. "Thank you." He showed her to the room, left her there with a basin and towel. She bathed in silence, letting the dust rinse away, and when she stepped into the bed, she pulled the quilt to her chin and stared at the ceiling until her eyes finally closed. Elijah sat on the porch, long into the dark, gun in his lap, watching the road. The next morning, Josie came out of the spare room wearing one of his old shirts, the sleeves rolled up. Her eyes were clearer. She looked different in the light, still pale, still wary, but something in her shoulders had settled. "Coffee?" he asked. She nodded, and he poured her a cup. "I can work." "You do not need to. I want to. I do not like feeling useless." He handed her a biscuit. "You are not." They spent the day side by side, feeding the chickens, mending fences, hauling water. She was quiet but not withdrawn. Elijah kept his distance, let her set the pace. When she smiled at something one of the hens did, he saw what she might have looked like before the bruises. That night they sat on the porch again. Crickets chirped. The stars were out thick. "You always live this far off?" she asked. "Peaceful here." She nodded slowly. "I have not had peace in a long time. You got it now." She looked over at him. The porch light touched her face and he saw how young she still was, maybe 21, maybe less. But her eyes looked older. "Thank you," she whispered. He did not answer. He just reached out and set his hand over hers on the railing. She did not pull away. Her fingers turned slowly under his, linking with his, and her breath caught like she was not used to being touched without fear. "I will not let anyone hurt you again," Elijah said. Josie looked at him for a long moment. Then she gave a small, quiet nod. And for the first time in years, she let herself believe it. By the fourth morning, Josie had started rising before the rooster. Elijah found her already outside, kneeling in the garden rows with dirt on her knees and a quiet focus to her movements. She was thinning carrots, her fingers careful and practiced. "You done that before?" he asked, stepping down off the porch with a bucket in hand. She brushed hair from her face with the back of her wrist. "My mother kept a garden back in Missouri. We always grew too much squash." He crouched beside her. "Guess we'll see if you've still got the touch." "I never lost it." The corners of his mouth twitched and he set down the bucket beside her. She reached for another plant without looking at him. "Elijah," she said after a pause. "What happened to your hand?" He glanced down. The white scar across his knuckles had faded some, but it was still there, a clean line that split the skin from thumb to wrist. He turned his palm over, flexed his fingers. "Rail tie snapped when I was 19. I was working freight out of Cheyenne. Doctor stitched it up with a horse needle and a bottle of rye." She nodded like that made perfect sense. "You stayed out there long, 2 winters, left when the contract dried up. Rode south then west, bought this land cheap off a widow looking to go back east." Josie sat back on her heels. "Ever think of leaving?" He pulled a weed loose, tossed it aside. "No, I built this place with my own hands. Every board, every fence post, I've already done my wandering." She studied him, her eyes equal parts wonder and caution. "I don't know what it feels like to want to stay anywhere." Elijah didn't answer right away. He reached for the bucket and filled it with the thinned greens, then stood and offered her a hand up. She took it, her fingers warm in his. "Then maybe here's a good place to learn." They spent the rest of the day hauling firewood and checking the far end of the pasture. Josie walked beside him through waist-high grass, her boots kicking up dry stalks. It was a quiet stretch of land, bordered by low hills and cottonwoods, with a stream that wound slow and silver through the middle. She stopped near the old fence line and leaned her arms on the top rail. "Back home, there was a hollow behind our house full of wild plum trees," she said quietly. "I used to climb one and stay up there for hours, just to get away from the noise." He watched her face as she spoke not the words, but the way her jaw eased when she remembered something that hadn't hurt. "Plums don't grow well here," he said, "but I've got cherry." "Wild ones up near the ridge," she turned to him. "Do they bloom?" "They do. Come spring." She straightened and touched the rail. "I'd like to see that. You will." That evening she stayed outside while he lit the stove in the kitchen. He looked out the window once and saw her sitting on the porch step, arms around her knees, watching the dusk settle in. Her hair was loose for the first time, falling down her back in a dark braid. She looked younger like that, but no less guarded. When she came inside, she brought with her the scent of wind and sagebrush. "Elijah," she said, standing near the doorway, "what do you see when you look at me?" He turned from the stove, took his time answering. "I see a woman who's still standing, even when the world gave her every reason not to." She didn't speak, but her eyes filled with something softer than he'd seen before. "I ain't afraid of what you've been through," he added, "and I don't expect you to be ready for anything. Only thing I ask is you don't lie to yourself about what you deserve." She stepped closer, slow and deliberate. "What if I don't know what that is?" "Then maybe we figure it out together." Her hand came up, fingertips brushing the edge of his shirt where it opened at the throat. She looked up at him, eyes steady. "I don't want to be afraid anymore." "You won't have to be," he said, and when she leaned in, he let her set the pace, her brow against his chest first, then her arms sliding around his waist. He held her, not too tight and not to fix anything, just to be there. The lamp burned low and the wind moved against the windows. Neither of them said another word. They didn't need to. August settled in dry and high, with skies so wide they felt like water stretching over the land. Josie stood in the barn doorway, wiping the sweat from her brow with the crook of her arm, watching Elijah repair the corral gate. His shirt clung to his back, dust streaking his trousers, and she noticed without meaning to how he moved with quiet certainty, every motion purposeful, unhurried. "You always fix things yourself?" she asked, stepping inside, her voice echoing lightly against the rafters. He glanced over, one knee braced against the gatepost. "If I waited for help every time something broke, I'd be living in a pile of wood and prayers." She leaned against a beam, arms crossed. "My father used to say that any man worth his salt should know how to build, plant, and butcher. You take after him, used to." Her eyes dropped. "When I was little, he'd let me help mix mortar. Said I had steady hands." Elijah straightened, brushing sawdust from his palms. "I'd say he was right." She didn't answer, just walked over and picked up the hammer he'd set down. She handed it to him without meeting his eye, then turned to the workbench and ran her fingers across a line of chisels. "You ever carve anything?" he asked. "Not since I was 13. I cut my thumb open trying to make a spoon." He chuckled, low and rough. "Well, that explains why I'm short one." That drew a quiet breath from her, almost a laugh. She didn't let it out all the way, but the corners of her mouth shifted. He watched her for a moment, then returned to the gate. The wood groaned as he set it back into place, and she waited until he'd latched it before speaking again. "Do you ever get scared out here?" she asked. He wiped his hands on a rag. "Not often, but sometimes." "Of what?" "Lightning. Dry season can turn this valley to kindling." She nodded slowly. "Mine was always silence, not the kind that's peaceful, the kind that means someone's coming." He didn't answer right away, then he said, "You don't have to be afraid of that anymore." "I know, my head does, I mean. But the rest of me still twitches at every step behind me." He leaned on the post, arms folded. "That's not weakness, that's memory." She looked up at him, her jaw tight. "I hate that it still runs me." He studied her face, how she stood like she wanted to be still but didn't trust standing still. "You're not running now," he said. "That counts." They stood in the barn's hush for a moment, the smell of hay and old wood between them. A horse snorted in the far stall, and outside, a hawk cried high over the ridge. Josie stepped closer, her arms falling to her sides. "You never ask for anything in return." "I don't need anything." "That can't be true," he shrugged. "I like having someone to share the quiet with." She looked at him then, really looked, and her voice came softer. "You don't miss company, friends, a woman?" "I've had all three. None stayed. And you're all right with that?" "I was." He held her gaze, not so sure anymore, her breath caught, but she didn't look away. "I don't know if I know how to be with someone, not in a way that doesn't cost me." He stepped toward her, slow and careful. "Then let it be simple. No debts, no cost." She reached out, fingers brushing his arm just above the elbow. "I'm not used to simple." "Then we'll go slow." Her eyes warmed, cautious still, but no longer closed. "You mean that?" "I don't say things I don't mean." For the first time, she smiled without hesitation, small but real. "Then maybe I'd like to stay a while." He nodded once. "You've got room here as long as you want it." Josie stepped past him into the light outside. The wind caught her braid and tossed it gently over her shoulder. She turned back, hand resting on the open gate. "I think I want to learn how to make that spoon again." He picked up the chisel and held it out to her. "Then let's start with steady hands." The first rain came in the middle of the night, a quiet patter that turned steady by morning. The air smelled of wet sage and dirt, and the hills wore a soft haze that made the edges of the world seem gentler. Josie stood barefoot on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, watching water bead on the railing. Elijah stepped out behind her, pulling his coat over his shoulders. She didn't turn, but he knew she'd heard him by the way her shoulders eased. "You ever ride in rain like this?" she asked. He leaned against the post. "Once, drove cattle up through Rawlins. Ground turned to soup halfway through, lost 2 horses and a wagon axle." She nodded, eyes on the distant line of cottonwoods. "Feels good, though, like the land's breathing easier." He glanced at her bare feet. "You'll catch cold." "I won't," she said, voice soft. "Not anymore." They sat at the table later, eating in silence. Josie kept glancing toward the window where the rain still streaked the panes in long, slow trails. Elijah didn't press her. But when she finally set her fork down and looked at him, her face held something not quite settled. "There's a woman in Willow Ridge," she said. "Mrs. Latham. She helped my mother birth me. If she's still living, she might remember me." He waited. "I want to go into town," she said. "Just for a few hours." Elijah set his cup down. "You sure it's safe?" "I don't know, but I can't stay hidden forever." He nodded once. "I'll go with you," she hesitated. "I'd rather go alone." His brow lifted, but he didn't argue. "You know how to load the rifle?" "I do." He studied her a long moment. Then he stood, walked to the cabinet, and pulled out the smaller Winchester. He set it on the table between them. "You ride out before noon, you'll make it back by dusk." She looked down at the rifle, then up at him. "Thank you." He didn't reach for her hand. Didn't need to by midday. The rain had lightened to a drizzle. Josie saddled the mare herself, packed a small tin of biscuits, and rode out with her braid tucked beneath her collar and Elijah's rifle across her back. He watched her until she disappeared around the bend, the sound of hooves muffled by wet earth. He spent the afternoon in the workshop, planing cedar boards for the pantry shelves he'd been meaning to fix since spring. The hours passed slow, the sky dimming without thunder. By the time he heard the rider returning, the sun had begun to slip behind the hills. Josie dismounted without a word, her face unreadable. She handed him the rifle, then stepped up onto the porch and stood beneath the overhang, dripping. "You find her?" She nodded. "She's still there." "Live's over the bakery now." He waited. "She didn't recognize me at first, but when I said my mother's name, her face changed." Josie paused. "She gave me a letter, said it was left with her 6 years ago. My mother wrote it before she died." Elijah stepped closer. "You want to read it aloud?" Josie shook her head. "Not yet." They stood in the hush between raindrops, the quiet of the land folding in around them. "She said I was meant to be raised by my aunt," Josie said, her voice low, "but the letter never made it. My step-uncle claimed me before anyone else could." Elijah didn't speak, just waited. "I keep thinking about what might have been different if that paper had found its way." He looked toward the hills. "It didn't, but you made it here." Josie met his gaze. "I'm tired of living by what didn't happen." He stepped up beside her, fingers brushing hers. "Then let's build something from what did." She looked down at their hands, then laced her fingers through his. "I want to plant something in the fall, for spring. Something that'll come back. We've got the space. And maybe a dog," she added. "One that barks at strangers and sleeps by the stove." He let a small smile reach his eyes. "I think I know where to find one." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wet wood and the promise of cooler nights. Josie leaned into his side, not out of need, but choice. "I think I could stay," she said, voice barely above the wind. "For good." He drew her hand up to his chest, resting it there. "Then we'll call it home." By September, the land began its slow turning. The cottonwoods yellowed by degrees, and the air thinned with the promise of frost. Elijah had begun stacking extra firewood beneath the lean-to, and Josie had pressed old flour sacks into window drafts with careful hands, her movements precise, her mind always a little ahead of the day. They lived in rhythm now, not out of need, but habit. Her voice in the morning, low and clear, waking him before the rooster. His boots beside hers by the door each night. Some things had shifted in ways neither of them said aloud, but they felt it in the way she lingered by the stove after supper, or how he waited for her to come to him, never rushing what was still unfolding. One afternoon, after pulling the last of the onions from the garden, Josie stood rinsing her hands at the pump, sleeves rolled high. Elijah watched her from the porch, a ledger open on his lap but unread. "You said you used to drift some," she said, drying her hands on her apron. "What made you stop?" He closed the book. "I got tired of leaving things half-built." She came up the steps and sat beside him. "You afraid you'll wake up one morning and want to do it again?" "No," he looked over. "I've never had anything worth staying for before." She nodded once, eyes on the valley. "I've been writing letters to my aunt, the one the letter was meant for." "How's that been?" "Hard," she said, "but good." She never knew what happened. She thought I'd been taken to the city. "She's in Kansas now, runs a millinery." "You thinking about going to her?" Josie shook her head. "I told her I'm where I belong, but I want her to know I'm safe, that I made it." Elijah reached over and slid his hand over hers. "She'll be glad to know." I'm thinking about changing my name back, Josie said after a pause. Granger never felt like mine. I was born Josephine Mayhew. He considered that. You want me to call you that? No, she said quietly, lacing her fingers through his. I think I like how you say Josie. By late October, they'd harvested what could be saved from the garden and set the porch in order for the cold months. Josie started hemming curtains from old muslin, and Elijah winterized the barn roof. The house grew warmer not just from the stove, but from the way their lives folded into each other. One evening, while she was mending a rip in his coat, Elijah came in from the shed with something wrapped in a bit of cloth. He set it on the table before her and waited. She unwrapped the bundle slowly, revealing a small wooden spoon, sanded smooth and shaped with care. The handle curved slightly, and etched into the back was a tiny bunch of wild cherries. She held it carefully, her fingers trembling just enough to mark the moment. I thought I'd try my hand at carving, he said. Didn't bleed this time. She looked up, eyes catching the firelight. It's beautiful. I thought maybe it'd be yours, first thing you didn't have to leave behind. Josie stood, still holding the spoon, and stepped close. I could have left. When the bruises healed, when I found the letter, but I didn't, I know. Because I didn't want to. I know that too. She set the spoon down and reached up, touching the side of his face with both hands. He leaned into it, steady as ever, eyes never leaving hers. When she kissed him, it was quiet and sure, the kind of kiss that came after long waiting and deeper understanding. That night, she didn't return to the spare room. She stayed beside him, her hand resting over his chest, her breath slow and even. Outside, the wind picked up, but in the house, there was only stillness. The winter came early that year, heavy with snow. They weathered it together, Josie reading by the fire while Elijah carved more spoons, each one a little better than the last. They traded eggs with neighbors and took in an old hound from a trapper passing through. The dog took to Josie immediately, curling beside her feet like he'd always belonged. By spring, the wild cherries bloomed on the ridge. They rode up together one morning, blankets packed in the saddlebags, and sat beneath the flowering branches while the world warmed around them. Josie leaned back against Elijah's shoulder, her fingers brushing the petals that fell into her lap. I never thought I'd have this, she said. You earned it, Elijah replied. She turned to him. Do you ever think about getting married? He looked at her, long and serious. Only if it's to you. Josie smiled, full and unguarded. Then yes. They married before the summer heat set in, beneath the cottonwoods near the creek where he'd first found her. Just a handful of neighbors, a plain dress, and a ring carved from a strip of silver Elijah had smithed himself. She tucked it on her finger like it had always been meant to be there. They planted plum saplings that fall. Years passed quiet and full. Josie tended a little shop in town, selling preserves and hand-stitched linens. Elijah bred horses and taught the neighbors' boys how to shoe them right. They built a home, not just in boards and stone, but in the way they looked for each other at dusk, the way they reached across the space between two chairs without thinking. In time, her letters to Kansas stopped needing answers. Her aunt had passed, peaceful and old, knowing her niece had made a life worth writing about. And when Josie stood beside Elijah on the ridge each spring, watching the cherry blooms fall, she no longer remembered the fear that once chased her. Only the man who waited for her to find her way home. They never left that land. They never needed to.